So we will now move to the question period with the audience. I'm told that there are two microphones on both sides on the room. So if you want to ask a question, I'll ask you to go to the microphone. I'll ask you to identify yourself and the person on the panel to whom you want to address your question. Please feel free to ask your question in French or English, but I'll ask you to be brief. Alors, si vous désirez poser une question, je vous inviterai à aller aux microphones qui sont dans les allées et de vous identifier en premier lieu et d'identifier la personne du panel à qui vous voulez poser la question. Sentez-vous à l'aise d'y aller en français ou en anglais. Alors, j'essaierai d'alterner chaque côté. Alors, vous pouvez regarder combien il y a déjà 3 personnes de ce côté-là, une de ce côté-là. Alors, les prochains pourront aller là.
The panel all mentioned the importance of collecting reliable data, but little was said about the uses that are made or misuses made of the data. So I'm wondering if we could hear some comments about what one does with this information that is useful or not or harmful.
Anybody on the panel who would like to answer that question?
Well, I thought we had a couple of very good examples of that. The ability to look at the country at a fine geography, I think, was clearly pointed out, and there's no other, I think, source in Canada, aside perhaps to some degree administrative data, that would permit you to do that. The other thing that's important is, of course, to look at very specific groups that don't show up in surveys. So many of Statistics Canada's surveys are of very high quality and of very large sample size, 50,000 or more households. And yet those still aren't enough to identify how immigrants fare according to which country they came from. They're not good enough, for example, to discuss the extremes of the income distribution. If you're interested in focusing on the top 1%, well, then you need very large sample sizes. And these are just only some of the examples that the census has been used for. How can they be misused? I'm not sure, but all data can be misused in the sense that the analytical quality is not very high. The other big threat in their misuse, of course, is to violate the privacy and confidentiality of Canadians. And Statistics Canada, I think quite rightly, has a superb reputation in ensuring that no individual identified information is released.
Thank you. I would say also, perhaps I could add, that the absence of total data would be some kind of misuse in a way of the data. If we don't have any data, you can say anything you want. So maybe I'll move on this side now, if you want to go for a
Hello,
question.
my name is Malcolm Olofsson, and in 2011 I worked in the gathering data in the 2011 census. My question pertains to the mandatory form, and looking at question 10, I actually have a copy of the 2011 census here. Question number 10 is probably the most useless question ever put in a census, because it provides you with no information. There are many useful questions which never get into the census, but why do we put in a question like, question number 10, does this person agree to make his or her 2011 census information available in 2103? Why? Of all the questions you can put in a census, this is a wasted question.
Actually, it's not, because when you fill out the census form, Statistics Canada is required to keep that information very confidential.
Sure.
Confidential. Throughout the 1990s, the then chief statistician wouldn't even release forms after people died and hundreds of years afterwards. And many Canadians, those associated with the genealogical community, for example, lobbied very hard for eventual release of these data. And so this is Statistics Canada being ultra cautious that you, in some sense, agree to the release of this information so that there's no question that your privacy is ever violated, even if it's after you've died.
I think perhaps what surprised a lot of times some people was the 92 years. Why was it not 100? But I think there is a specific portion in the law or something like that. It's not a random number, but I think a lot of people were saying, why 92? Why not 100? Why not, 90 years?
But are you suggesting then that the census information should never be released, or?
No, continue the current policy, which is to keep the information confidential, but after you die, 100 years from now, they've released all the census information from 1901, 1905, 1906, 1911. And at that time, it was confidential. Now, we have no control over what happens 100 years from now. And we don't care what happens to us 100 years from now. None of us will be here, I guarantee that.
Well, except I think the only thing
This shows the power of the privacy lobby. I mean, to get a useless question on the census when there's hundreds and hundreds of relevant questions, which you could get on the census, and you've got a limited space to put relevant questions. Why put a useless question on there?
Yeah, those are all fair comments, but again, it's parliamentarians who ultimately sign off on this, so I think if Canadians feel very strongly, you can certainly lobby and influence that process. But the ultimate sign-off is by the people we've elected.
So I'll move on the other side. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Laura Laughlin. I'm an economist in the private sector at a consulting firm called Analysis Group. In my abundant spare time, I also am a founder of a group called the Institut des Générations. We do what we think of as civic hacking, I suppose. And we collect indicators on 27 different dimensions of well-being in Quebec and in Canada. And first, thank you, everyone. It was a really interesting panel. But my question is much more big picture. I think, for me, the question is, what's next? We can't just sit here and say, great, we have the census, when there's so many more things that we could be doing with the data that would be so much more compelling. You only have to look south of the border and see a website called opportunity.census.gov, and you see how all of these data are put in the hands of citizens. And for the data to be in a windowless room in universities is a tragedy, especially when we're giving away so much information for free. So for me, I'd like to know what you folks plan on doing to take it out of the universities, out of the Jean Talon building, and into the hands of community.
Do you want to answer to some of that?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, well, that's a very good question. I think it's the most important one as well. We are in a world in which things are changing rapidly, in which the resources, as I mentioned earlier, are quite limited, both in the private and the public sector, and in which the needs of our citizens and our clients and friends are immense. So we want to look ahead and see how to make the most effective use of innovation techniques in various complementarity manners, to which I alluded to before in a very brief manner. So we want to, for instance, to generate a better cohesion between the availability of survey data and administrative data, geographically based data, but in a manner which might be more micro-based than was described somewhat earlier. So we want to make sure that these data are widely accessible and in a manner which is open both to the public sector and to researchers as well as to the private sector. I think we want to make sure that our connections, our collaborative work is most effective possible, meaning that the abilities, the resources that we are respectively using are in as much as possible joined together, meaning that at the federal level, I see this every day. We have constant demands for information and guidance on what better policies could mean. In many cases, we don't know where to look to. We know that somewhere in the community, it might be in the private sector, in the academic sector, in the nonprofit sector, there are resources, there are people there able to assist, but the connections may take time, and the demands are often very time sensitive. So in many cases, unfortunately, the opportunities of working together, the various communities together, are wasted. So we want to find again innovative manners to make the connections work better between the various sectors of our society. So, of course, I'm I'm not being terribly precise, but I think I'm making allusion to ways in which we can do not only better now, but we can do better over time.
I guess I would like to hear something from one of the other panelists too. It would be interesting to hear that perspective.
Can I?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, you know, we're seeing baby steps. There is progress being made. I'm thinking of new pilot projects, for instance, where we have data linkages today with health surveys and others that were not, you know, even fathomable 10, 15 years ago. So these kinds of changes take time. I'm optimistic. I mean, more surveys are being, you know, allocated to the RDCs. Every year I see sit-in, I keep asking about the annual survey of manufacturers, and I'm optimistic that one day maybe we'll see that also, that kind of information be available to others. But these things take, changes take time, and I think, you know, perhaps one day, you know, we'll be like some of the Scandinavian countries where, yeah, the data, personal records can actually be accessed, you know, from all over.
I think that takes time is a terrible response, unfortunately, especially when you're forced to pay, you know, $1,000 to the ESQ for getting basically a median measure or having data on income broken out by quintiles. I think it's an absolute travesty. And what I think we should see is actual, you know, policies and not just platitudes about it taking time and go ahead and keep it in the academia, it's fine. That's just not enough.
It's a political matter, right, in that sense?
No,
But
agreed.
if I might add on that, though, I think, you know, at the Quebec level, for example, they have put together a committee because the idea is how to make the data more accessible and more easily accessible, not only to researchers, but also, you know, to the public. And I think right now they are also constrained by, you know, many different laws within each organization. But I think there's really a willingness. I agree with you. I would like that it would be available tomorrow, but I think we'll have to work with those, you know, those constraints that we have there. But at least, you know, we're moving in the right direction, and I think that's
agreed.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to the next.
If I
Except
could
you
be
want
so
to add?
bold, though,
Yes.
is to say, maybe another piece of this debate is to give thought to what you can do as data users to organize and to look to us in the United States, because part of this is also organizing data users to communicate the importance of data and the policies that you want to rally around. So I just encourage you to look at the Census Project model as maybe one you want to try to emulate if it could work here in this country.
Okay, just before I move to the next, Ian wants to add something.
I'd just like to add that I think we are making progress. I think part of the reason why there is slow progress is that while your intentions may be absolutely altruistic and towards the public's good, we already know that there are predatory private sector organizations that are using the currently publicly available census data to prey on vulnerable populations. Check cashing stores is a prime example of that, and there are others. So there are valid reasons why we have to think through a process carefully to strike the right balance of protecting citizens, but also supporting this open data concept moving forward.
That's very outmoded in today's day when you have people voluntarily exchanging lots of their data for free on platforms.
But that's also their choice.
No, but agree, but what I'm saying is that a lot of this, the population has moved beyond that bit. So I think there needs to be better communication about the trade-offs because it's already happening. And there's already tools to exploit what's out there already publicly, like it or not.
I just want to lend my support to the questionnaire. I think if we are going to ask Canadians to mandatorily fill in this form, they should have ownership as well. The world has changed much more rapidly than our many institutions sort of can adapt to. And I think there's a real big onus on the table for Statistics Canada and the government to make the data as accessible and as easily as possible, even in an interactive way on their websites. And there's a lot more that can be done than actually is. You even see that already in the United States. But I think you've hit on, I think correctly, the very important issue of accessibility here and how dramatically society's changed in those dimensions that bureaucracies have trouble keeping up with.
Okay, thank you. So I'll go to the next one over there.
Amazing, thank you. My name is Sabina. I just graduated from McGill with an undergrad in epidemiology and medical anthropology. And I've been working with the IHSP for the past 4 months on a project looking at the census's lack of methods to enumerate trans people on this current census, and the methods they are going to be using in the 2021 census to change that and to do so. For those people who don't know, there is a low estimate of about 500,000 trans people who are either incorrectly enumerated or not enumerated at all on the census, current census. They also face some of the highest health discrimination policies in the entire world. Suicide rates for trans people are about 41% attempted, so it's pretty bad. So my question is, there's been a lot of activism around this and a lot of news stories around this, but what is Statistics Canada, what is their commitment to seeing this process change? I know that they are currently forming a working group to re-envision the question, but that working group is subject to politics, it is subject to budget cuts, it is subject to just simple transphobia. And this needs to happen. So if this census fails, what is the backup plan? So how can we prevent this method from failing? That's what I'm asking.
Does somebody want to answer about that? Well, the what part I know, because I've raised the question at Statistics Canada, and what I was told that they are they're in close, talk with all the other countries, because I know in some countries they have started testing the question.
Yeah.
As you said, I think they have a working group now. They are minimally committed to, I think, to leave an open space in the gender. I'm not sure that they will be going out. I don't think they were ready because they would have needed to test the question and all that. Mm-hmm. And usually they start the process 3 years before the census. Now there was the time frame was so tight. But what I've been told was that there would be open space when they ask people about their gender, so that they wouldn't be forced to sign in one or the other. And I think that's what I know for now, but I wouldn't, swear for them. They're not here. But I know they're really taking the issue seriously, and they've been working with other countries to how to get to that in the next census.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else in the panel who has a comment on this? Okay, good.
Yes, well, I may say something which is going to be very general again. I thank you for your comment. I think it's extremely important to be as inclusive as is possible in our society, and it's true in various matters. So I thank you and encourage you to keep suggesting ways in which our society can be more inclusive. To be honest, I have not followed as well as Céline has been able to do the details of what you are describing, but I will make sure that I know a bit more about the issue. And if you're willing to give me or my team your contact details, I'd be very happy to come back to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
So go on the other side.
Hi, I represent a program called the Community Data Program. We're a consortium that purchases data mostly out of the Census and previously the NHS for municipal and nonprofit organizations. My understanding, just with respect to the question that was asked before regarding the accessibility of the data, is that census data is all free now. All this data is free. It's just their time at Statistics Canada is not. It used to be based on licenses, and there were cell counts that you paid money based on the number of data cells you were getting. Now you get it, you can freely distribute it. I'm assuming that the limits to accessibility are just budgetary, is that it's your time. But I'm curious, for people who know the insides of the mechanism, what other barriers do you see to making, if we so decided we could turn over all this data that we've purchased and distribute it freely, there's no longer any licensing restrictions on us. But it's not in our interest because it undermines the consortium model. But what barriers do you see outside budgetary constraints that are limiting the global distribution of these data?
You want to answer?
Thank you for that. You're actually pointing out a very important policy change at Statistics Canada under the current chief statistician. So it used to be when you wanted some series, you'd have to pay by accessing it on the website. And a large amount of information is put up on the website for free. And if you want some very specific tabulations that aren't there, as you correctly pointed out, then those tabulations have to be made and processed, and you're paying for that time. I think the question about accessibility is sort of you having more fuller control over that, and the release of anything that's potentially individually identifiable. Here's an example that, for example, bothers me. If we have a 1 in 5 census, then 1 in 5 of those people will also be part of the 1 in 5 in the next 5 years. So we have a nice longitudinal data set inside of the census. That's information on the table. Statistics Canada's never put that together in an accessible way for people because of the risk of identifying people. So that sort of stays behind the curtain. So you can think of other examples.
Suppression is built into all of the, when they're building a table, it's built into the algorithms. Like if they produce,
that's absolutely right.
If they produce tables at the DA level already, what is the barrier to just, the time has been done, the programming has been done. What other barriers exist to just releasing that low-level geography table? It's generally below the CMA level that things become costly. So,
I mean, just to add to that, I think if you want to manipulate the data based on the individual level files to create your own tabulations, for instance, like the Gini coefficients, right? They will be run at the provincial level, sometimes at the city level, but if you want to do a regional analysis or neighborhood level analysis, you have to work with the microdata, right? And there are other things that aren't necessarily done. So for instance, geography, the boundaries change from census to census because of administrative changes of various kinds, amalgamations. That means that it's difficult from a comparative point of view if you want to do analysis of change over time. And if you want to recreate those boundaries, the only way you can do so is to go back to the micro level. So those kinds of tabulations are still part of the special tabulations that require programming and whatnot. So unless you're willing to pay and wait for them at the StatsCan level, you have to go into the microdata centers and work with those files by yourself. There's a cost to that, right?
I mean, I'm just thinking of standard geographies, standard tables, standard, it's all coming out of the census. I'm not thinking of getting into the individual answers.
Because I think they put a lot, perhaps we'll have to ask them the data because unfortunately we don't have anybody from Statistics Canada on the table, because I think they tried to go quite low with the geography level, and perhaps at some points because they're afraid of that the numbers, they're not...
Identification, absolutely.
Yeah, there could be residual disclosure too, depending upon how many of these
the cost tabulations, yeah.
But one thing is sure, as Miles said, though, I must say that the chief statistician is very committed, and one of his mandates is to really try to increase, access and, make it as easily accessible. And also, but you mentioned, I think they are indeed constrained by budget because
it's mostly cost.
Over the past 10 years, they saw their budget being cut. So, that's probably part of it. So, if you don't mind, I'll have to move on the other side.
Benoît Laplante, je suis professeur à l'Institut national de la recherche scientifique. I don't have a question, I've got a comment and a suggestion, and it's somewhat related to at least two interventions. We've been illustrated the importance and the fantastic things we can do, people can do with census data by the presentation by Zmal Korak and Sébastien Brault. And I would bet that a year ago, in similar circumstances, we would have a third presentation by Jean-Yves Duclos using his own data, StatsCan data. No one tried to convince us that the census data was interesting using publications by Statistics Canada. What we saw was a product of research by researchers having access to those wonderful data. I would just want to draw your attention to one thing. If you read the law that that was sur la statistique. I don't remember the name in English.
Statistics
Canada
Act.
Act, yeah.
Great. Sometimes the translations are simple. If you read it, you will see that basically the mandate of Statistics Canada, its mission is to collect and publish. There is nothing about making accessible or making available. So we researchers, but also the general public, over the last decades have become extremely dependent on the data collected by Statistics Canada to understand the Canadian society. But somehow the law is stuck somewhere between 1945 and 1970 in its spirit. It's still to collect and to publish. So I would take the opportunity to suggest to the minister, who apparently has some contact with the Minister of Industry, that maybe it's time to add a sentence somewhere in that law to add to the mission of Statistics Canada, making the data available to the general Canadian public. It's a suggestion. And I hope that talking to someone who was a user of those data in his academic life, as Van Korak or Sébastien Brault or myself are right now, it will ring a bell. Thank you.
Je peux vous suggérer aussi peut-être de m'envoyer un message?
Je vais le faire avec plaisir. Je vais le faire avec grand plaisir.
Bon, c'est comme ça, je ne l'oublierai pas.
Merci.
So we can go on the other side.
Hello, I'm a graduate student in political science at the University of Laval, so obviously I empathize with all the queries and the concerns about the availability of the data because I'm trying to assemble my own thesis at the moment. But in reference to building up a system that's very similar to the Scandinavian one and making all this data accessible, first of all, what's your perception of how the general public would feel about having all this available data to the general public, all this confidential information available so quickly? So I apologize for playing devil's advocate here. And secondly, what other political barriers to making this data accessible? Because the Scandinavian model is all about this accessibility as well as, I would assume, evidence-based policy making. So what barriers do you perceive for attaining this level?
Anyone interested? Well, and if I may, while my dear colleagues are thinking, two things. First, I think we have a strong record. When I say we, of course, Statistics Canada has a relatively strong record in collaboration with other institutions to make sure that confidentiality is of utmost importance. So I think there's always a risk, but I think my view is, I may be wrong and I will be corrected if so, my view is the risk, the current risk is quite low and can be managed to remain quite low. The second point about political concerns, it's really a matter of attitudes. Of course, from a political perspective, you may believe that if there is less information in the public, you're in better control of the agenda. It's easier to defend your policies because you have the power of having more information than anyone else. So it's really a matter of how you feel towards a public debate, towards openness and the ability to manage a modern society in which people demand and I think can expect information to discuss in intelligent manners the best ways forward. So it's a matter of attitude, and as we heard earlier, we in a democracy have the ability to influence these attitudes, and it's a joint responsibility on the part of officials and politicians, but also on the part of citizens to decide on what kind of attitudes we think are correct in a modern society.
Thank you. And is anyone else answering? No? If you'll allow me a second question, do you feel citizens are ready for all this information to be made readily available? Obviously denominalized, so all personal information is taken away, but do you think that private sector researchers can have such an easy access to information and then citizens are okay with that? Do you think that they would be okay with that? You don't have to answer, just maybe consider.
I think so.
You think?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Again, confidentiality has to be always kept in mind. People, for human reasons, human nature works in that particular manner. People want to feel secure and safe. That's a very basic human need. Once this need is met, once people have confidence in security and confidentiality, then I think we can expect our citizens to behave again in an open and transparent manner in their public life.
If I may, I typically think slower, so I'm coming back to this idea of barriers, right? It's interesting. Minister Duclos was talking about change of attitudes. I'm very much looking forward to what the response rate on the 2016 census will be, right? What is the legacy of the voluntary census we had in 2011? If I look, for instance, at the geography of those 1,127 communities for which data was not released because of the higher than 50% non-response rate, I look at places like Saskatchewan, where there are 338 communities which did not release their data. That's like 4 times any other province. Why is that? So I'm a little concerned about that. That's a big barrier, and I don't know what that means moving forward, right? So.
Thank you.
And I guess just to pick up on that with your question about acceptability of having that data out there, I think where there's a split in society right now. There's many who are giving away that data every day, don't really care. It doesn't really impact them. They don't see the perhaps relevance. But there's those who, there is a great distrust of government. We see that growing in a number of different ways. Not, of course, not the current federal government, but governments generally speaking, small g government. And we see that in so many different ways. So I do think that it's not going to be an easy answer either way.
Thank you. On the other side.
Hi, I'm Jacob Greenspan. I just graduated with a BA in Economics and Political Science from McGill. And we heard a bit about data linkages today, particularly around tax data and census income data. But it seems to me at least that this is kind of an underutilized approach and it's just relatively new. So I was asking, I guess, one, if that impression is correct, and then what are some of the pros and cons of this approach, and what are some other linkages maybe that could be further exploited?
If I understood the question correctly, the census actually, and many other Statistics Canada surveys, ask permission to get income information from your income tax files. So we're seeing increasingly a mixing of survey and administrative data. This is a trend that started some years ago, and I think it's fair to say, given a speech that the chief statistician made in New York a couple of years ago, that it's part of the innovations that are going on now in Statistics Canada, and part of the legacy of the last census, a much higher tendency to use administrative data, more of a tendency to link those data, and to blur the boundary between survey and administrative data. The plus side of this, for example, is that response burden is reduced. So you don't actually have to go through a whole docket of very detailed income questions anymore if you give permission to Statistics Canada to use these data. So it's sort of seen as an efficiency measures. But already many of our surveys have this mixture of administrative and survey data. And my suspicion, or not suspicion, but my intuition suggests that Statistics Canada will be moving down this avenue very directly in the coming years, continuing a trend that's been going on for some time. Does that speak to what?
Yeah, I guess I was just curious why it seems like something that just started more recently, and maybe why that hadn't happened as much in the past. But
it's been going on in the past, and you bet it's going to be continuing.
Okay. Is there any more question from the audience? If not, I'll ask one. Mostly to the minister. Because, we need to make some changes to the Statistics Act to make sure that it never happens again, that some decisions are made politically based, with the result that we're having with worse data at a higher cost. And I was thinking, would that be ways to perhaps increase the independence of the agency, going along the United Nations principle about, statistics and stuff like that. So just to make sure that we don't have to, go through that again, except that it won't give us the occasion to celebrate the return of the census. But any thoughts on that?
My short answer would be no. I don't think we can prevent a government from changing any law unless there are constitutional ways of doing this. But as you say, as you know, changing the constitution in Canada is not a terribly popular agenda. So it's a matter of democracy. I think citizens have the duty to elect the government which they want to have, they want to see in power. And if that government chooses to make information less available, want to create a less transparent society, then if that's what citizens want to do, then they are entitled to do so. And to change the law of statistics, Canada wouldn't be, I think, unless I'm mistaken, wouldn't be a protection against a move by another government to change again that law and remove the particular features of a particular census or survey.
Thank you. Any members of the panel want to ask each other a question or want to say a last word before we close?
Well, if I may, Maggie-Jo, I heard with great interest the one point that you mentioned, which is that in the U.S. you were successful at doing many of the things you did because you grouped the energy together and you formed perhaps several associations, but one of them was well organized enough and sufficiently powerful to have an influence in Congress. And I think it's an important lesson for us Canadians as well. I think on this issue, as well as for several others, for political reasons, but also for pure management factors, it's often useful to organize ourselves together and I have the Canadian Data Research Centre is in mind here, and other examples, other arrangements, other associations would do similar, would reach similar outcomes. When we work together, in particularly when we work together in trying to affect the way in which our governments work, we have a greater chance to achieve a good outcome. So I would again point out that this particular manner of operating in the U.S. can have some good lessons for us in Canada as well.
Any other comments from the table? If not, well, this is now my time to thank the panelists for their insightful presentation. One thing we know for certain now is that we need good data, and I think we'll continue to talk about getting good data and trying to make them as accessible as possible. On behalf of the Center of Population Dynamics, I want to thank the panelists, but also the audience for your questions and participation. And we would like to encourage you to spread the words among your friends, and if they win the long form census this time, encourage them to fill the forms because I think they're very needed data. And on that, please, thanks a lot, and I ask you all to join us for the reception that will be just outside of the room. Thank you very much.